This is the 16th and final lecture for machine learning and Bayesian inference. You made it to the end. Congratulations. In the last lecture, I looked at how you might do exact inference in a Bayesian network, or on a Bayesian network, in a way that exploits the structure that Bayesian networks introduce, in such a way that you might expect, depending on the structure, to speed up the computation over and above what you might expect to get if you'd done it just in a naive way. I'm left with just two things to finish off today. The first is to talk a little about approximate inference in a Bayesian network, and the second is just very briefly to introduce an alternative representation for a joint probability distribution in some Markov random field. So, you will be familiar with Markov chains because you will have covered them last term in the data science course. So I'm hoping that you can still remember at this point something about how they work. They are fundamental in the approximation method we've already seen, the Metropolis-Hastings algorithm, and they're fundamental here as well, in what's called Gibbs sampling, which I'm about to introduce you to. So just to quickly recap what's going on with a Markov chain, we have a collection of states, and the idea is to move probabilistically between them. So we have a probability distribution that tells us how we transfer between states. Here from state S to S prime. This is fixed. There is for each state a probability that you will go from it to one of the others, and the game is to set that up and allow the states to change from one to another probabilistically according to these distributions, and then see what happens. But the key idea is that if you allow this procedure to continue for a bunch of discrete steps, okay, we're in a start state, there's a probability distribution of going from that state to one of the others, we sample it, we jump to the one it gives us, and then we repeat using the distribution for the new state. Now, if we do that, then let's say we do it for t steps, there'll be a probability distribution that tells us the probability that we've ended up at the end of these t steps in one of the available states. And that distribution is something that we can compute because there's an update equation, so that if we have the distribution at time t tells us the probability that at time t we're in any of the states, then we can compute the probability that we're in any of the states at time t plus 1, because we just sum over the possibilities. We look at the probability that we're in each of the possible states, and then the probability that we go from that state to one of the new ones at time t plus 1. Okay, so this is just straightforward probability, as usual. Now, if we get to a point at which this distribution becomes stable, the distribution over states at time t plus 1 is the same as the distribution over states at time t for all of the states, then we've reached the stationary distribution. And at that point, we know that for all of the states, the distribution is given uniformly by this equation, and the distribution is going to maintain stability. It's going to be unchanged as we keep jumping from states to states. Now, I don't want to recap the conditions that are needed in order to make sure that there's a stationary distribution and that there is only one. But if you look back in your notes, I'm pretty sure you will find some conditions that allow you to say that there'll be exactly one stationary distribution. And this is useful because it allows us to set up a way of sampling from a probability distribution on this collection of states. And we want maybe to be able to set up the actual transition probabilities so that there's this unique stationary distribution and it's one that we're in some sense interested in. Okay, that's the name of the game here. Now, I'm pretty sure that also, if you look back in your notes, you'll find the concept of detailed balance, or local balance, as it's sometimes referred to. And I need to update this slide because the relevant course is no longer called Mathematical Methods for Computer Science, it's called Data Science. But detailed balance is a straightforward condition that tells you essentially how the transition probabilities might relate to the stationary distribution. And a standard way of proving that you have a particular stationary distribution pi is to show that you have detailed balance when you combine it with your transition probabilities. And detailed balance just says that for all pairs of states you have this relationship. Stationary probability for one times the probability of going from it to somewhere else is mirrored, in that the stationary distribution for the somewhere else multiplied by the probability of coming from there to where you are is the product gives you the same value. Okay, and that works for all pairs of states. And the reason that that allows you to show that you have a stationary distribution pi is straightforward. Okay, we just have some very simple manipulations here. This is the equation that tells you how the stationary distribution is updated from step to step. Okay, just look back here. It's this guy. Okay, we want to show that that remains invariant. If we plug in this instead of this, because that's the definition of detailed balance that allows us to do that, we get the first line. This now doesn't depend on s, only on s prime, so it can come out of the sum. And the sum is 1, because if we're in s prime, then the sum of probabilities of going from s prime to another state over all possible states has to be 1, because we have to go somewhere. Okay, so we get this, which is what we want. Okay, and we've shown that pi is the stationary distribution, and all we've needed to do that is know that you've got detailed balance. So where is all this going? Well, we return again to the underlying equation that tells us what we're trying to do here. We're trying to, in some sense, deal with conditional probabilities that we infer from a Bayesian network. We're interested in the probability of, or the probability distribution of some query variables, conditional on actual observations, and to compute that we need to sum over the latent variables. Okay, I've summarized this many times, I don't need to dwell on it again. But the idea now is that instead of trying explicitly to compute that conditional distribution, we're going to ask if we can sample from that conditional distribution. Okay, because being able to sample from that distribution will allow us to compute pretty much anything we like. So the idea is to generate samples from this distribution. And it's going to turn out that, in fact, it's entirely sufficient to generate them from this one. Okay, the joint distribution of the query variables and the latent variables given the observations, because as we'll see in a moment, we can just throw away the samples we get for the latent variables. Now, that only leaves the question of how you generate samples from this distribution. And it turns out that we have this beautiful method called Gibbs Sampling, which has much wider applicability than just inference in Bayesian networks. Okay, if If you want to sample from some distribution, Gibbs sampling is extremely general, and the idea is very simple. But I'm going to keep it grounded in this context of sampling the distribution that's set up by a Bayesian network. Now I'm going to simplify this slightly because it just makes it easier to write. Let's just imagine we've only got one query variable Q. Everything else just goes through with no problem. It's just easier to write if I only have one. So the state of our system in Markov chain terms will be the queries, or the query, in the way that I'm going to describe it, and the latent variables. Okay? The state is just the values that those random variables have at a particular time. Okay? And that means that we set up our Markov chain. We want the stationary distribution to be this one. Okay? That's what we're aiming for. That way, when we jump around, we get to the stationary distribution, we'll actually be sampling from the probability of Q and L conditional on the observations. And I just need a little bit of notation here, which is to say that S with the bar over it and a subscript of I is a state that's had the ith element of the state removed. Okay, so that could be the query or it could be one of the latent variables. It's just the ith thing in the state when we represent the state in this way. Okay, so here I is missing. The ith element is missing. And the idea of Gibbs sampling is very straightforward. It says that in order to move from one state to the next, okay, in order to set up our transition probability, which is what this is, we just replace the ith element, okay, for one step, by sampling its distribution conditional on all the others. Okay, that's it. We look at this distribution, which of course is going to depend on how you've set up the Bayesian network, okay, because the distributions that you attach to those nodes, the conditional distributions conditional on the parent of each node, okay, will need to be used to work out what this conditional distribution is. But the idea is that we move from one state to the next just by replacing one element of the state, and we do that by sampling that element from its distribution conditional on the current values of all the other things in the state and the observation values. Okay, so we just pick an I and resample in this way, and that's how we move from one state to another. Now the great thing about that is that it has detailed balance, and it has the distribution that we want as our stationary distribution. Okay. Why does it have detailed balance? That is easy to demonstrate. So, here is our initial product. Okay, that is the left-hand side of the definition for detailed balance. Okay, that's this guy. We want to show that it's equal to the right-hand side, this guy. And that's pretty straightforward. The stationary distribution, okay, the one we want, is this. Okay, that's pi, the stationary distribution, because we want to sample from probability of the state given the probability of the observations. The transition probability we've just proposed is this. Okay. We're sampling the ith element of the state conditional on everything else. In the second row, all I've done is split the state S into the ith element and all the rest. That's the only thing that's happening in the second row. In the third row, I've done the usual trick of splitting probability of A and B is probability of A given B times the probability of B. Okay? So probability of Si and S bar I is the probability of Si given S bar I times the probability of S bar I. And as usual, we can just leave the other conditioning events on the right-hand side. Okay, that's the only thing that we changed to get to the third line. Now we do the same trick, but we do it backwards. Okay? We take these two terms and we turn them back from a conditional and a prior into a joint probability, namely this one. Okay? Because the probability of S prime sub I and S bar sub I, it splits up into that product there. And finally, that is the right hand side. This here is the right hand side of the detailed balance condition. Okay? Now, that shows that this way of updating states has detailed balance with the stationary distribution that we want. Okay, and so we've shown that Gibbs sampling in this case will allow us to sample from the stationary distribution. Okay, which corresponds with the probability of queries and latent variables given the observations. Now, why has my slide got select all written all over it? Come on, there we go. Now, the nice thing here is that it may in fact be possible to further exploit conditional independence, because in sampling from the probability of the ith element of that state conditional and everything else, we may be able to drop some of the conditioning events out for the same reason that we've been talking about all along. Conditional independence basically does that. It allows you to say that the probability of A given B and C is the probability of A given C. You're dropping out a random variable. Okay, now you should still be asking the question that kind of obviously presents itself, which is how do you sample from the transition probability here? Okay, how do you sample from this guy? Okay, well, it turns out that if you design your Bayesian network, particularly using standard distributions, then this often becomes quite straightforward, and there are plentiful known methods for sampling distributions on one random variable, which you can put into practice there. Okay, so the answer is it depends on the design of your Bayesian network, but this is generally something we can do. Now, the only thing that's left is to say that that allows you to sample from the probability of the query and the latent variables given the observations. But I still need to show you why that allows you to sample from the probability of Q given the observations simply by sampling from the joint probability of Q and L and ignoring the L's. So how do I convince you of that? Well, the easy but possibly still slightly opaque answer is that it's sort of just implicitly marginalizing. Okay, but let's look at it in maybe a slightly more convincing way. Let's say that we want to see, or that we want to compute an expected value. Okay, because if we can compute expected values, we can do pretty much anything we want to. Well, an expected value is now going to look something like this. Okay, expected value of some function of the query variables given the observations. Okay, the first line here just writes this down from first principles. Okay, that's just the definition of expectation of a function of a random variable. The second line here I've done the marginalizing trick backwards to put the latent variables back in. And in the final line, I've just now moved one of the summations. Okay, so sampling using the joint probability for Q and L and throwing away the L's when I compute the expectation is just fine. We end up with the correct expected value. Okay, so by being able to sample from the joint probability of Q and L given all the observations, we can essentially just throw the L's away, and we get samples according to Q, probability of Q given the observations. So the last thing I want to do is just introduce the idea of a Markov random field. Now this is an alternative to a Bayesian network. Its purpose is exactly the same. Its purpose is to represent, or allow you to provide, a convenient representation of a joint probability distribution, which you can then use as the basis for performing inference on. Now these are sometimes called undirected graphical models, or Markov networks, and they express conditional independence assumptions, as we might hope, because we've seen that those are useful, but they do it in a different way. So, once again, defining these is pretty straightforward. We now have an undirected graph, again with the random variables that we're interested in as the nodes. Okay, so we still have a node for each random variable of interest. But then instead of defining everything using conditional probability tables, one for each node, we do something slightly different. We look for the cliques in the graph. Okay, now a clique is just a subset of nodes, each of which is connected to all the others. And specifically we look at maximal cliques in the graph, because a clique of, say, 5 nodes will contain some other cliques of 4 nodes, and we look for the biggest possibilities. Then for each maximal clique in the graph, we introduce a thing called a Clique Potential, which is just a function of the random variables in the nodes that form the clique, and the only condition we have on that is that it's greater than 0. And then the probability distribution that's represented by this Markov random field is just given by the product of the clique potentials for the cliques, and it needs to be normalized so that everything sums to 1. And that's it. That's a Markov random field. Okay? And it is once again representing some probability distribution on a bunch of random variables using a graphical representation. Okay, the only differences really are that it's no longer a directed graph, and instead of attaching a conditional distribution to each node, conditional on its parents, we attach a clique potential to each maximum clique. Then the probability represented is the product of all those clique potentials that's then been normalized. So here is an example. I have an undirected graph here. I have 3 cliques of size 2, which are actually the 3 lines joining the bigger cliques, which are shaded. I've got 2 cliques of size 3, which are these guys here, and 1 clique of size 4. So with each of those I associate a clique potential phi, and the probability distribution on my 9 random variables, because I have 9 nodes, is just the product of those clique potentials. So again, it's a straightforward way of representing a probability distribution. Now the test for conditional independence, once you've set up one of these, becomes very simple indeed. Okay, the test for conditional independence now just says if you've got subsets x, y and z, then you remove the nodes in z and any of the attached edges on those nodes from the graph. And if you've now got no paths from any variable in x to any variable in y, then x is conditionally independent of y given z. Okay, so that's now a much easier test for conditional independence than the one that was required for a Bayesian network. Now, at this point, I ran out of time, and it's the end of my notes, and this lecture will finish slightly early. But that's really as far as I'm going to go, other than to say that Markov random fields, as you might expect, now have their own collection of algorithms for performing inference. There are trade-offs between Bayes nets and Markov random fields that might make one or the other more desirable depending on the application that you have. Okay, so clearly Markov random fields don't really express the causal nature of your problem in the way that a Bayesian network might. We no longer have this directed graph where we say that one variable has a direct effect on another. Okay, so there may be applications where one is clearly going to be preferred over the other, and they have further trade-offs that might make you compare one over another. For example, Markov random fields don't require the functions that you use in defining everything to actually be distributions. Okay, that means that you potentially have more flexibility when you design Clique potentials. But the other side of that is that with a Markov random field, you do have to be able to calculate z, okay, the omnipresent thing that normalizes the distribution afterwards. And as we've seen, although that is in principle just a sum or integral, it can often be something that's actually very hard to compute in practice. And there I have to finish. Thank you for following the course, and I hope you found it interesting and useful and a source of ideas. It was set up very specifically with the aim of introducing some of the more foundational aspects of machine learning via the medium of Bayesian inference. And I hope that that's given you more of an insight into both how these methods work and how you might use this kind of foundational material to develop new methods of your own. There's still a lot more to this field, and I hope you feel still inspired to look further, because there's some really fantastic stuff out there, and hopefully this has given you a decent start in carrying your studies further. So I wish you luck. Machine learning and Bayesian inference are both great things to be working in, and I hope you take this material and have fun with it, because having fun is important as well.